All right. Hello, everyone, and
Everyone, welcome. Hi, Casey. Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
hi. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual art salon with Eric Haze, Katherine McMahon, and hosted by Guild Hall's own Casey Dalene. My name is Anthony Madonna, and I'm the Patty Kenner Fellow in Arts Education here at Guild Hall. Not here, not physically. This is my apartment. But I'm not going to speak too much about the artists. I simply want to let you know how this platform will work and the format of today. The talk will be about an hour long. We're looking at around a 40-minute conversation between Eric, Katherine, and Casey, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Throughout the entire talk, your microphone will be muted, and we ask that you please watch in speaker view so that you can have the correct view of all the work that Eric is sharing. To switch your view, if you look on the upper right corner, you either at the moment are seeing speaker view or gallery view. If you click that, you will be in speaker view so that you can see who is ever speaking at that moment. Additionally, if you have questions that you want to ask as the talk is going on, or if you have a really poignant question that you want to be addressed in that 15-minute Q&A, please do use the chat feature, and that's towards the bottom of the screen, left to the green share screen button. If you open that up throughout the entire talk, simply write a question in that chat, and I will write it down and send them to Casey to be addressed during, or in the 15-minute Q&A portion, I will contact you directly to ask if you'd like to jump on. We'll unmute your mic and you can ask your question to Eric. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Casey. And again, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Anthony, so much for that. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks for inviting us into your homes, per se. You know, part of this, the reason I wanted to do this series of art salons is so that we keep the dialogue going, even though we can't be socializing together at art openings and art gallery talks, artist talks. I know personally I so miss those events and seeing everyone and continuing the conversation that we all are so involved in. So the technology is not perfect here in Zoom, but we will make it work so that we can still all continue to keep in touch and be able to gather at least in this way. So yeah, I am Casey Dalene. As Anthony said, I'm the curatorial assistant at the Guild Hall Museum in East Hampton, New York. I'm also a registrar and the museum education associate. I'm going to, again, like Anthony said, talk to Eric and Katherine for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So we have, as you can see, you'll see that the screen is labeled Katherine McMahon. They're using Katherine's computer at the Elaine de Kooning house in East Hampton. You'll see Eric Haze on the right and Katherine McMahon on the left. They are in the studio at the moment with some of Eric's and one of Elaine de Kooning's beautiful paintings behind them. I wanted to say hi to Katherine first. Katherine is also an extremely talented artist. She's a beautiful painter. If you want to see her work, you can go to her Instagram. It's at Katherine McMahon _ on Instagram to get in touch with her. She's the director of programming at the Elaine de Kooning house and the former creative director and photography / writing contributor for Art News. She studied fine art at Towson University and at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Katherine, I wanted you just to give us a quick background on the house, the history of this residency program, and tell us how you're doing and how you're faring during this time of isolation.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Casey, for saying that. So, yeah, basically, here we are out in Northwest Harbor in Elaine de Kooning's former home. She bought this house in 1975. 3 years later, she added on the studio, and she painted people from the Brazilian soccer star Pele out on the back porch, to the Motown Records executive Berry Gordy here. She did some of the most significant work in her later years here at the house. And after her death, the sculptor John Chamberlain owned the house, and then Richmond Burton, a painter. And currently the house is owned by Chris Byrne. And since 2011, the house has been an informal residency program, as well as hosted exhibits and events. And yeah, I mean, Eric has been here for a few months on and off now. Back towards the end of 2019, he came out, basically, Carlo McCormick, the writer and historian, put us in touch with Eric and told us the backstory about how he'd been painted by Elaine in the 70s. You can see that painting right up here.
Excuse me for just, sorry to interrupt, Catherine, but can you move in closer? Several people are having a hard time hearing.
Oh yeah, sure.
Much.
Good. Yeah, so Eric came out in late 2019, and you know, obviously the world has changed dramatically early on this year, and his residency kind of got shifted in a new direction and extended, and you know, I think it allowed him to create more work than I guess initially anticipated. So yeah, so here we are coming up on Memorial Day, and
It's been an amazing ride.
Yeah, definitely. So Catherine, are you sheltering at the house and you've been there this whole time?
Yeah. Yep. I have another little zone on the other end of the house where I've been painting. So Eric and I have, through this thing, we've, you know, while we're both here, kind of socially distanced and tried to, you know, create on our own and then come up for air and compare creative notes and things like that. So
And cookies, I heard you were baking cookies.
yeah.
In the New York Times, I read that you were baking cookies.
Baking and cooking therapy, you know.
We've been a two-person support network for months now.
That's great. That's so great. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for sharing the information on the house and the residency. I just wanted to also give a little background on Eric as well before we dive into that. You can follow Eric on Instagram at Eric Haze NYC, and his website, www.erichazeffineart.com, actually has some of these paintings, some of the completed works he's done in the residency recently uploaded in the last week, if you'd like to really pour through those again, independently of this. Eric, as Catherine mentioned, had his portrait painted by Elaine de Kooning, and along with his sister, you'll see it behind him. It's the color piece on the wall behind Eric in 1972 in New York City, her inner city in New York, and she was an early advisor to Eric with painting and art, which I'm sure he'll get more into. And in the 1980s, Eric was a part of the Soul Artists, an influential New York graffiti collective, and he showed alongside Keith Haring and John Michael Basquiat. So he's had quite a lovely beginning of his art career there. He was, of course, always making art, but also started a graphic design business where he had clients such as the Beastie Boys, Public Enemy, and LL Cool J. So he's worked with some really phenomenal other creatives through that business. And in 2019, he had 3 very large paintings on exhibit at the Beyond the Streets Art Fair, just this past art fair. He is married to the incomparable actress, dancer, and activist, Rosie Perez. So Eric, a little background on you. It's not everything, but enough to give people an idea. How are you and Rosie faring, and how has it been? What kind of time are you spending between New York City and out here?
We're doing good, actually. You know, it's changing winds, and every day brings some new surprises, but we're doing surprisingly well. I mean, truth is, you know, that quick math, we knew we were some of the lucky people who weren't stuck alone. And you know, these are we're sort of here to talk about art, but really the conversation about humanity is sort of integral to everything we're talking about. And, be it art or isolation or what everybody's going through emotionally, these are new and different times.
It's very different. It is interesting. It's interesting how much our personal lives come into the conversation because we are all communicating and working from our homes and juggling that along with our jobs or staying in touch with one another. So that's become such an integral part of the conversation, interestingly enough. So tell us a little bit about the portrait that Elaine did of you and your sister and how that came to be.
Well, you know, some of my memories a little fuzzy from 10 years old, but my father taught at Columbia, and one of his students who he was very close friends with, David Shapiro, notable poet and art critic, I guess was very close friends with the Elaines and with the Koonings, excuse me. And I don't know exactly what their handshake was, but as a favor to my father, David arranged for my sister and I to sit in Elaine's studio, and I have really sort of tremendous memories of it. I think we sat maybe 2 or 3 different sessions, and my sister and I would take turns sitting individually, and while my sister sat, Elaine would give me paints and materials, and you know, by the end of it, I think we were off to Pearl Paint to buy linen, stretchers, and materials, and the rest is history, as they say.
Amazing. So that really inspired you to paint and be an artist. That's amazing.
Well, the interesting subtext to this whole experience here is that, for better or worse, I had really never pulled the lens back in my life and my career and sort of emotionally this far back to being 10 years old. A lot of the stuff you sort of checklist and describe of my later work and career sort of eclipsed that initial spark and path of being sort of an expressionist painter, if you will. And, you know, the world blessed me with this just amazing, magical, unbelievable opportunity. I took it to heart, not just as an opportunity to make art and as an opportunity to sort of spread my wings, but really to challenge myself in a much more profound way, emotionally as well as creatively, and really come in here with a very open mind and open spirit to sort of allow the magic to happen instead of walking into it with too many preconceived notions.
Sure, definitely. Talk a little bit about your work up till now. Obviously, black and white is a huge theme, and sort of more abstract work, and then coming into the architectural work that you were doing more recently, and then to the figurative work.
I'll try and break that up into a few quick sections. You know, I sort of walked off the playing field of fine art and painting to some degree as a younger man when I made different sort of perhaps more commercial choices. And I lived in California for 10 years where I was sort of focused on the brand and fashion and different things I was involved in at the time. But I returned to New York about 15 years ago, and I had already started painting a little. And had sort of made a promise to myself to paint more because I was enjoying it so much, but I did not anticipate just how much it would really grab and move me when I returned to New York 15 years ago. You know, all the spirits of my youth and the voices of Keith and Jean and you know, perhaps even a little unrealized promise from those days in my own head. And I picked up a brush with, you know, serious intentions about 15 years ago. But to your point, at that time, I was sort of clear in understanding that graphic design was so much part of my DNA that it wasn't something I could just forfeit and leave behind. So I'd say the first 10 years of the last 15 have been sort of challenge myself as a painter in terms of materials and comfort zone, and sort of rediscovering myself as a painter through more graphic interpretations, if you will. And it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago that I sort of had an epiphany moment, and I started taking some of the style and sort of technique I was using in abstract work and applied it to reality and figurative work for really the first time ever in my life about 3 or 4 years ago, starting with architectural work and focusing on a lot of New York landmarks and sort of cinematic scenes, urban landscapes. And that is sort of the bridge, if you will, that prepared me emotionally and stylistically to take this leap of faith here.
Yeah, yeah. And when you first got there, your first work, can you talk about what you first painted when you got to the residency?
Yes, well, the first thing I sort of jumped obsessively into was a sort of 360-degree study of the studio itself. I mean, aside from the experience of being here, from the day I walked in the studio, it was just God's studio. It was, this was a temple to me from day one, and I sort of, you know, approached it that way with a world of respect and just, you know, the energy in here is different. I think in our conversations by now, you know that I virtually never sleep here. I see the sun come up every night because it's just too exciting to be here. I don't want to waste a minute of it. But again, to your point, the first work I finished, and I've done, say, 4 different chapters or bodies of work here, was specifically hard-edged architectural work, which also sort of relates to some of the work I was doing in my late teens, of very architectonic work. But that was in my comfort zone, and that was sort of the thing I had to, the itch I had to scratch before I sort of took a few other hard left and right turns.
Sure, sure. And then coming into it, did you know you were going to be doing figurative work? Was that a goal, or?
Yes, it was a very sort of private, personal glint in my eye, if you will, coming out here. I had literally never done that kind of figurative work, human figure, portraiture, but it was my end goal coming out here, and in a way that, again, I understood that this was a bridge I had to find my way over naturally, both in terms of sort of finding my voice and applying styles from other applications to a new sort of format, if you will. And I really was very, very patient with myself, starting, you know, with drawing, and I spent weeks and weeks drawing the figure and creating drawings and studies for the painting. And I really sort of gave myself a lot of room to get comfortable before I jumped into what I considered really the essential work. And you know, another subtext to that was, it almost goes without saying, but I certainly did not take lightly either reinterpreting Elaine's original work or, in fact, painting her at all. These are sort of holy grail things, both in my life and some of them in the historical consciousness, that you know, I felt like if I was going to really take on any of this, that I had to do it with a real sort of a patience, but a seriousness of intention. And these there are now 30 completed paintings here, and I'd say only about 5 of them were pieces that I came in here with an intention, knowing they were a target.
Sure, sure. So your subject matter that you've been focusing on is Elaine herself. I see behind you, and some very well-known imagery. And then I also see that it seems like you're recreating her painting of you below her painting we see in the back. Talk a little bit about your inspiration to do that.
Well, that was one of the clear targets I came up here with, was to reinterpret her original painting 1-to-1 scale in my black, white, and gray palette. Was really sort of the essential difference. So I've done 2 reinterpretations of that painting, along with the larger work behind me that includes 8 of her paintings of JFK that I had to reinterpret individually in this one painting. But that was the known quantity that I was shooting for in the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Are the works behind you completely finished? Are these?
Yes, except for the larger one with Elaine on the ladder, which we'll talk about a little later, I think. That I have incorporated 8 original drawings of living contemporaries of mine on the floor of this painting, replacing the sketches of JFK in the original photograph. And part of the process prior to even arriving here was sort of having an open discussion with a handful of friends and peers about what I was about to take on, and asking them if they would participate by letting me take their portraits and give me a thumbs up on comfortably knowing they were going to be included. And I was able to take 6 of the 8 portraits before C19 shut us down. So it is 98% finished, minus 2 illustrations in existing pieces of paper on the floor. And I'm actually had a sort of light bulb moment that I'm going to take those last 2 portraits digitally on Zoom when I get home. And, that will be sort of symbolic of the transition that has shaken out literally during the creation of this painting.
Yeah, definitely. Who are those figures that you've chosen to focus on?
Brian Donnelly, otherwise known as Cause, Lee Canones, otherwise known as Lee, Doze Green, otherwise known as Doze, Todd James, otherwise known as Reese. Am I forgetting someone? And Jose Parla, known as Jose Parla. And actually, Carlo McCormick, who made this introduction, who's a just wonderful world-class art critic. He's also, I'm putting him in it as a participant in the experience.
Great. And you're also doing individual portraits of those individuals as well, correct? Larger.
Yes, it was actually a little sort of disjointed time-wise, because I had done those drawings and the portraits of everybody probably maybe as much as 2 months prior to jumping into actually painting them. And it was important to me to have created the drawings originally and then interpret them into the painting, so that there were sort of existing artifacts that existed in the painting, and then when it receives exhibition in due time, then there's really about a dozen, maybe 18 portraits and busts and full-length pieces, drawings that will accompany the painting in an exhibition.
Definitely. And you've also chosen to paint yourself, obviously, when you're replicating Elaine's painting, but in different other stages of your life as well. Can you talk a little bit about why that's part of the focus of the work?
Yeah, this is the happy accident, an unexpected surprise of this whole experience, sort of what I'd call the middle chapter, which was that I had an intention originally to paint a third interpretation of Elaine's original painting with only myself with myself now. And we had shot that current portrait for that. When I put that single portrait on the rectangular canvas, it just felt a little lonely to me. And I happened to have one square 42-inch canvas prep sitting around, and I thought, you know, that single portrait would look better alone on a square. So I switched up and I did that on a square, and then it just took over. What I think conceptually, what clicked for me was that painting, exploring myself in images and self-portraiture was a really sort of comfortable learning ground for me. If you're a writer and you're supposed to write about what you know best, I started by drawing what I was familiar with myself, and you know, with an emotional connection to all the images. You know, one of the things I took with me that I've heard Elaine say, which was that it doesn't really matter how great looking someone is. If they're not interesting to you, then she didn't want to paint them. I think sort of tangentially, if you will, that notion stuck with me. And prior to turning my lens on Elaine or turning my lens on my friends or sort of preparing to take on the world outside my head, I thought that the self-portrait series actually was made for a nice bridge, both emotionally and sort of technically. And, you know, I dived into that, and I did 3, and then I just kept wanting to do more and kept digging in hard drives and finding more images that, you know, I'd been living with for my whole life, and sort of re-experiencing both those images visually and all the memory and history and sort of emotional content that came with them fueled a lot of the work along that period.
Yeah, there's some pretty striking images. Well, Eric will show us around the studio at the end to give us an idea of some of the other works he's been talking about just now. But so you've been there since January, am I right?
Since I headed out sort of the day after Christmas. I actually painted here through New Year's holiday. My wife had been shooting on and off, but pretty solid for 6 months in London and Bangkok. And so I was sort of planted for that season, raring to go to jump into this. And sort of the first minute she got home and planted and we had a holiday, I was off to the races.
Yeah, that's great. So, and do you guys have a plan for how much longer you're going to be there, or? Well,
you know, it like everything in the world now, this sort of became rolling news. You know, one of the sort of markedly ironic, interesting things about this experience was that I had put myself in forced isolation before isolation was a necessity. And I was actually thriving off that sense of isolation, just, you know, down the rabbit hole in my own head, going till I dropped. But so it's almost hard to remember how the world used to be. It seems like so long ago now that, you know, Katherine and I and the proprietors of the Residency were sort of, we were always back and forth sketching out the next schedule. And I actually came up here for what I had considered the final, most essential session, and really the one I was jumping into the work behind me And literally the day I was coming up was the day the world caught fire. And people were calling, you know, my wife was freaking out, understandably, that I was on my way out into the world when everybody was supposed to shut in. But it created a sort of, I don't know, I hit a switch right away, where I was so far along this journey and so ready sort of for the championship rounds, and I made it my emotional and sort of professional priority to tune everything out, to do everything in my power personally and creatively to hold on to the magic, to not let the changing tone of the world really affect the tone of my work or the beautiful bubble that I had sort of created for myself here. And that was a challenge, and you know, a daily conversation. Obviously, Rosa and I talk, you know, a million times a day, and you know, as you know by now, because we understand each other's sort of creative and professional space, she championed my ability to tune it out and gave me all that extra measure of support to just, you know, don't worry about me, do your thing, and we'll get through it. And I'm really pleased sitting here now after the fact that I did have the tools, wherever they came from, to keep my wits about me while most everybody else was losing theirs.
Yeah, that's a challenge for everyone to keep moving forward and to stay focused on your work. You're in such an inspired and emotional state, I'm sure, working and painting, that can really jar that experience. So do you feel like this body of work is coming to an end or almost done as far as you wanted it to be at this point soon?
Yes and no. You know, it's been a push and pull, because every time a new light bulb went off in my head, I put whatever I was doing down and chased a new rabbit down the hole. And, you know, I found so much gold down those holes, I wouldn't change anything, but I kept doing that at the expense of pushing the known deadlines back further. When I finished here about 3 weeks ago, I considered myself having crossed the finish line, in terms of having sort of bottled what I came out here to do. And, you know, I can certainly look around and find 30 things I want to tick or touch up, or we'll get a little attention before they see a gallery wall. But the challenging part and the total focus that I needed to get across that line, that I'm in a different headspace now about the work. And this is the first time I've been out here since sort of, you know, going 18 hours and crawling back home for a week.
Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you for joining us while you're out here. This is wonderful. So speaking of galleries and the future, do you have, and it's hard for anyone to make plans right now, just how uncertain the future is, but do you have any plans, or are you speaking to anyone about showing this body of work, or what's next for you?
God willing, this will definitely all see a wall in the right white space when the world is back up and running. Sort of goes without saying, whatever conversations were in the works about finding homes and giving this work the light I hope it deserves, you know, the conversations are on hold along with a dozen other projects. But you know, that said, the interesting thing is how much the conversation is changing on a day-to-day basis. You know, some of the people I was engaged in talking to about brick and mortar shows are now having discussions about potential online shows. And you know, as far as this body of work goes. I've sort of split the difference. I made a choice heading out here to be very transparent on my Instagram and sort of to share the experience and take everybody for the ride along with me. So I've posted a lot of this work sort of in progress, and as it was fully realized, I started to post it. And as you mentioned, I've put all the work I'm prepared to show on the website recently, but by the same token, there are probably half a dozen works here that really demand to be seen in person for the first time. So I'm sort of trying to be a little judicious about not putting everything out online, and saving a little magic for in person when the day comes.
That sounds great. Well, we have a lot of questions, Eric, that I'd love to get to, some really great ones. Anthony, should we bring people up on the screen if they want, or I can?
Sure, yes, I'll go ahead and do that. First, we're gonna have Andrea Grover, the Executive Director of Guild Hall, come on and ask a question.
Cool.
Hello. Thank you so much for doing this, Eric and Casey.
My pleasure. I'm so happy to be here again.
Good to see you again. So my question had to do with that particular community that all converged in New York downtown that you were at the heart of, and how, you know, Brian Eno uses that term scenius to describe when a particular scene or a collection of creative people creates a collective genius. So I imagine that you're still in touch with, even virtually, with artists and musicians, designers, and other folks. I just am trying to get into the mindset of you having shifted from like a kind of urban environment where there's a lot happening. And how are you tapping into that energy, or is this just a different moment in your life?
It's a different moment in my life. Interestingly enough, someone chimed in to my Instagram early on in this experience. Wait a minute, how can you make art in such a peaceful, perfect environment without the chaos? And my response was that, yes, once upon a time I fed on the chaos. And, you know, when you're sort of a younger person finding yourself and sort of channeling influences and everything's a little more in flux, I felt personally I needed the world and to participate in the world more to find myself at that point. But I think later in life now, I value the not just the isolation, I value the quality of space results in quality of focus to me. So I feel like I'm able to work from the inside out in my head now in a way that is sort of independent of the kind of influences I needed and enjoyed as a younger person. But
that's wonderful advice for everyone right now, as we're all isolating, whether we've chosen as an artist to isolate creatively or not, to be looking inward and thinking that way. That's great. That's great.
Our relationship and our conversation crosses these boundaries, because you were first here. We spent some time here in the studio early on, pre-crisis, and we had been sort of hashing out plans to have some people here and hold some events here. And I'm happy. We've transitioned online now. You know, everybody's doing a little quick math and going to Plan B, but. I'm so happy we're still here doing this despite the circumstances.
Thanks. We can't not continue these conversations and these experiences and get the word out about what you're doing. It's incredible. Anthony, do we have another question?
Yes. Here's another question. I will just ask this. This is from Richard Gerst. He says, all artists have moments of highs and lows creatively, and is wondering, how have you found those moments or dealt with them over your painting time? Do you simply wait for inspiration in down times? Do you temper yourself as you find yourself in the middle or end of a high volume creative time?
Good question. I think my first answer to that is part of the reason I started painting again was because so much of my time and intention was fueled by deadlines and marketing and sort of meeting the world halfway. I wanted to carve out that space for myself where if the phone wasn't ringing or the world had no demands on me, that I could sort of travel my own road and that there was no direction or sort of market end goal, that I would find a way to do things more personally. So in a way, that's the answer to the question, is that it wasn't always true, but if there's a flat spot in my life or you know, I was even sort of encouraging my wife on the phone yesterday that, hey, you know, art has saved us every time from every low moment in my life. You know, be it personal heartbreak or, you know, professional challenges. I've always hung my hat on the work, and the work has sort of saved my soul. And, you know, that's a big part of why I carved out this lane to do work that was more connected to my heart and my soul. And that endeavor is something that well cultivated and well protected is something nobody really can tamper with. There are no low times unless you create them in your own head in that sort of context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's great. The art is so healing. Of course, we all believe that. Yeah. Actually, Claire Watson just asked if that's kind of a follow-up to that question. You know, she said she understands what you mean about working from the inside out. Do you also look at other art or artifacts, and or do you take inspiration or find your work influenced by music or things you are reading?
Yes, all of the above. You know, I think that the second part of what I was saying is that, and hopefully this work speaks for it, is that I've become much more interested in the world around me. I've become much more interested in other people and other people's experiences and, you know, learning from other people and being challenged by other people. And I think that goes hand in hand with challenging myself creatively. But, you know, especially having run my own brand, which was my own name, you know, sort of the promotional mentality got built into so much of what I was doing, that it's, I sort of lost my track there, but it's a very different approach to what I know what it was, that I was sort of forced by necessity in nature to constantly re-examine and re-express my own identity. That's what having a clothing company under your name is. You've got to find a way to refresh that same name and that same essence over and over again. So after so many years of doing that and sort of being submerged into what do I have to say about me that people might be interested in, probably as sort of some measure of personal growth too. And, you know, getting married really changed my life, and Rosie's activism made me a much more sort of conscious and activist at heart as well, in ways I never was before. And I think the change in personal growth I've sort of allowed myself over the last 10 years of sort of getting married and finally growing up, allowed me to see the world in new ways that were just exciting and interesting to me. And I leave this studio feeling comfortable and confident with portraiture now, but it's no longer about me. I'm heading out to capture the world and you know, that it's my voice is inherent in that.
Yeah. You can see that in your shift into the portraiture, into the figurative work, that you're now focusing on your friends and colleagues or inspirations like Elaine and et cetera, to outward, to respect and explore those people. So we also have a lot of requests, Eric, to see more of your work. Do you mind giving us a look around the studio before we have to go?
Sure. How close are we on time now?
We have about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Just, there might be some questions, or if you want to focus on a couple of the pieces.
Okay.
You spoke about the architectural work a little. You could show that.
What I'll do is I'm just going to take a quick sort of 360. I won't go too slow. I won't go too fast. I sort of don't want to over-explain the work and process, but at the same time, after I do that spin, if people have questions, happy to answer them, okay?
Okay, sure.
Good. All right, here we go. And Katherine's here. And some of this is unpublished. Okay, so I'm going to take a spin here. These are some of the ink drawings from my initial studies of the studio. And I also brought some of my existing current work out here, sort of architectural night series, so that it could have a conversation with what I was doing here. And these were some of the first self-portraits I did, sort of applying the sort of deconstructivist style I've been working in. And then Katherine, stay ahead of me. This is a portrait I did in the last session of me in my LA days in the 90s. And I hope the camera's okay, because it's a little awkward. That is the architectural series.
Yeah.
And as big as this studio is, I ran out of room. So this is the portrait I painted of Elaine, probably about 3-4 weeks ago in the last session, which was very emotional for me. And that is the original of her portrait of me and my sister from '72, along with the reinterpretation, one of the two. That one I kept sort of soft like hers. And then this is the grand piece we were discussing.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot to this. There's a lot, the real true subtext to this is the push and pull of history, both mine and my contemporaries. And I wanted this painting to speak for sort of the arc and the relationship from Elaine's generation and abstract expressionism to my generation. And I think there are valuable connections that can be fleshed out over time.
Oh, these are great too. Yeah.
And that's the second reinterpretation. I did a little more in my sort of harder graphic style. And that's the single one I ended up reproducing in a square.
So just briefly, yeah, oh, right. I'm sorry. You were still up high on the.
I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time seeing what you're saying.
That's fine. I was trying to follow you. It's great.
And last but not least, on the left is the painting I painted under Elaine's tutelage in '72. And
the colorful square pieces.
Colorful one, which I stretched myself at the time. It's a wonderful mess on the back. And these are the 3 reinterpretations, which I did the second 2 last night.
Wow.
And then there's Grandpa Lou in 1919, which was another rabbit hole. And last for today's show is I painted this last night too.
Can you lift it up just a little bit? Yeah, there you go. Wow.
I painted that last night, and the interesting thing about that is that I took the broken frame of Elaine's original painting and used that as my palette knife, and that painting was created at 2 p.m. last night using broken frames of Elaine's painting.
So you were using the broken frame
Yes.
as a palette knife, as a tool to
Yes.
apply the
Yes,
paint.
I was poking around for the widest palette knife I could fabricate on the fly, and I thought that was a nice spiritual token to do it with.
And when you say broken frame, was that from her original portrait of you that was, or what frame was broken?
Yes, my father had the original de Kooning painting was my father's. From a divorced family, it was in my father's house for years, and when he passed in the 80s, my mother inherited it, and I'd say about 4 years ago, I stole it off my mother's wall, and it hangs in our living room now.
That's awesome. That's great. Another question that I'd love to address. Did Elaine photograph you for the portrait? Christina Strassfield was wondering, because she did that with so many of her subjects.
No, they were all done live in person, and I remember the studio vividly. I actually remember the big JFK paintings very well, and I remember my father explaining to me what they meant and why she was doing them. Yeah, I remember walking by Union Square after we left her studio, just being elated, sort of tugging on my parents' coats to drag them down to Pearl Paint for supplies.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you were able to spend a lot of time. I mean, sitting for a portrait, you're spending a lot of time with the artist and in their space. So yeah, of course, you remember it.
I remember Elaine as generous, but authoritative. She was the boss.
Yeah.
And she let everybody know it.
She's not gonna let you horse around in her studio too much, unless it was with paint. Or
well, you know, whether they are real or imagined, I have certainly taken on Elaine as a spiritual guide, artistically, but also as a voice. I mean, you know, Elaine, I was thrilled when I found out that Elaine was a tough Jewish girl from Brooklyn, my wife being a tough Brooklyn girl. And there is, in everything I've heard, in both my personal memory and everything I've heard, which I've actually limited myself. I didn't do a ton of homework coming up here because I didn't want to have a lot of preconceived notions, but Elaine had a very tough spirit. She was she was smart and she was no nonsense. And, you know, I sort of get chills saying it right now, that there's a fierce independence to Elaine's spirit and an uncompromising vision of her own that throughout this experience, I've adopted that voice. I've adopted the ability to say, what would Elaine tell me to do? Mm-hmm. Or what would, you know, there have been times where, you know, I've been in here and you know, I'm about to do something against the grain or maybe piss someone off, and I say, you know, Elaine told me it's okay.
Permission, and she's a good source. She's a good source. If she permits it, it's
yes, it's my new blanket permission.
That's awesome. We had two questions actually about your materials. We didn't really talk about the medium. Are they oil or acrylic?
They're acrylic. I've been, you know, in my black, white, and gray world. It's a very simple science of black and white and reducing it to shades. I started with the acrylic because it was comfortable, and it's how I paint now. But interestingly enough, one of the things that I found a little something in was I came up here knowing that there was going to be a challenge capturing some of that her painting was so about it being oils in its own way that it might be a challenge to capture that the acrylic might be just come across much flatter in a way. And that's true to some degree, but I found little pieces of magic pushing around white into the pencil to get it dirty and muddy and feel that way. And, you know, some I was consciously trying to capture a little bit of that without parroting it. I've been very, you know, that's the fine line, and that's the dance, is reinterpreting her work while being entirely respectful of it, but not handcuffed by it in a way that I'm just painting by numbers, and it's just not that interesting.
Right, sure. So in your painting that you did in 1972 in her studio under her tutelage, the small colorful painting, was that on raw canvas or raw linen? There was
raw linen, and that is oil on that.
Yeah.
And you can see, you know, where the colors are picking each other up. And when I reproduced or reinterpreted those, sort of the very last piece I did walking out last session, and the first two I did last night coming back in, unlike other work, I worked on everything wet, so the colors were dragging each other, and they weren't. Typically, I let a layer dry before I come back to the next layer. The interpolation of trying to get it to behave like oils was about just keeping everything wet and letting it mash together a little. But I have heard the voice in my head saying maybe it's time to try oils at some point.
At some point. And the large painting you did, you said just last night, is that also on raw canvas or raw linen?
Yeah, you know, it's probably less stable and you know, ready for every fingerprint, but that was, for whatever reason, that's how I did the original one, so I didn't want to tamper with that.
Yeah.
And I know we're wrapping up. I want to share one last thing that I think sort of speaks for the abstract stuff, which is that if I had any cue coming out here, and it's a cue that just kept capturing my attention at home with the painting in our living room, it's the unfinished corner of the painting. It's the fact that she didn't feel she had the courage and the conviction not to have to finish every stitch of the painting. And, you know, I think my natural sense of scale is to blow everything out and cover every inch. And that was such an important cue to me in this whole body of work and experience, was to remember to let everything breathe, to remember that things didn't have to be finished, and to sort of, if there was one word that embodies Elaine that I aspired to, it was fearlessness. Mm. And, you know, I've achieved that in other works and other mediums and other styles, but that was the challenge with portraiture, and this next step was to get to that place where I felt like I was fearless again in this medium.
Yeah, when we first met and I came for the studio visit, I was definitely very impressed by your excitement and your fearlessness to jump into the figure in all these ways, and how much you were tackling it with your sketches and your studies, and just the sheer confidence and happiness. You were so thrilled to be jumping into this form. And so that really took me back. And I just remember being so impressed by that confidence. And I love that you've maintained it. I love that you're still enjoying them, and that I guess that was part of Elaine's inspiration and you know, voice in the home as well, pushing you and making you be true to yourself. And it's a great body of work. It's really impressive.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And it has really been one of the most magical, transformative experiences of my life, both personally and creatively. And, you know, I have this experience is encapsulated in the residency, but it's something I will take with me for the rest of my life in a big way.
Of course, of course. How amazing. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing, giving us this behind the scenes look at the studio and what you're doing, and all the works in progress as well. We really appreciate getting to see all of that.
And thank you for welcoming me into the Guild Hall family. You really have. Since the time we've met, you've made me feel so welcome and so part of the family. And it's a joy. I'm glad we could do this today.
That's wonderful. Well, we at Guild Hall really embrace our local artists and of course celebrate the history of the arts out here so much. And Elaine was actually very involved with the museum. So knowing your beautiful connection with her just makes so much sense. And we're so glad to have you out here celebrating that and celebrating that history and your history, and it all coming together is wonderful. It's wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, I came out here a lot in the 70s as a kid, and I have actually reconnected with the Hamptons and this part of the island throughout this process as well, and expect to see more of me. I plan to stay engaged out here.
I hope we do. That's wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us, for spending your time with us today on this beautiful afternoon. And I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to be posting this on YouTube, or we've recorded it. So for those people who didn't get to see it, definitely let them know that it's going to be available to watch later. And if you are able, I know it's a hard time for so many, but donate to Guild Hall. You can go to our website, guildhall.org, and donate to continue supporting programs like this that we're doing digitally. And you can also support for free by sharing, following, subscribing to our YouTube, all these wonderful ways of engaging with us. Join our newsletter. Those are all wonderful ways to support us that don't cost a dime, just a little bit of time. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for joining us today. Great questions. I loved the engagement. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you, Eric and Katherine, wherever you are.
Fantastic. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you so much, guys. This was wonderful.
Bye.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.